Most of us have probably heard about antibiotic resistance and understand intellectually about its serious threat to our public health. But 5 years ago, I had a much more personal experience with the consequences of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. My daughter was an infant, and I discovered a tiny pinprick cut on my knee. I didn't think much about it. I put some over-the-counter antibiotic on it, covered it with a Band-Aid, and went on my way. But that tiny cut got infected. And over the following 3 days, in spite of 2 doctor's visits and 3 different antibiotics, that point of broken skin grew to a redness that reached from my ankle up to the middle of my thigh. This was a serious bacterial infection. My doctor told me that if this last antibiotic didn't stop the infection from spreading, I would end up in the hospital for intravenous treatment by one of the strongest antibiotics we still have at our disposal. This was terrifying. Not only might I be separated from my infant daughter to be in the hospital for a few days, but also the bacteria infecting me might not even be stopped by this antibiotic of last resort. I'm very grateful that that last antibiotic did work and I didn't end up in the hospital. But the reality is that every year, 35,000 people aren't as lucky and die from antibiotic-resistant bacterial infections. This is a problem that's not just intellectual. This is a problem that's impacting thousands of people and their families every day. So how do we address this medical crisis caused by antibiotic-resistant bacteria? Well, one way is to simply try and increase our arsenal of different antibiotics. The more different drugs we have at our disposal, the more likely it is that doctors can identify one that will kill the specific bacterium that's causing your infection. So how do we find new antibiotics? Well, we can think about where our current antibiotics came from. Now, for many years, I might have answered that question by saying, the drugstore, or maybe a chemistry lab. But it turns out that more than 70% of the antibiotics used as clinical therapeutics today are made by or derived from compounds made by soil bacteria. That's right, we use the compounds made by soil bacteria to kill the pathogens that are causing human infections. Great, so let's just head out into the yard, grab some dirt, and find some new antibiotics, right? Well, for decades, that approach actually worked brilliantly. It's what built our current arsenal of antibiotic drugs. But over time, we stopped finding new antibiotics using that approach. Instead, we just kept finding the same old known compounds over and over again. But this approach didn't stop working because we discovered all the possible drug-like compounds made by soil bacteria. No, in fact, if we look at the genomes or the DNA of soil bacteria, what we see is that many bacteria, even some that have been studied for decades, have the capacity to make many, many more drug-like molecules than they usually do when we grow them in the lab. In other words, they have the ability to make these compounds, they just aren't. So why not? How can we access this rich reservoir of potential new antibiotic-like compounds? Well, my lab is focusing on ways to do just that. It turns out that, like us, bacteria are social creatures. In the natural environment, bacteria don't live alone, even though that's the way that microbiologists have long grown them in the lab. No, in the soil, bacteria are surrounded by hundreds of other microbial species, and they talk to these other bacteria using chemical cues. It's these chemical cues that we use in the clinic as antibiotics and other drugs. And we can think of these chemical cues like different words of the chemical language that bacteria use to interact. So taking this analogy a little further, we can imagine that bacteria are like people. Now, some people only speak one language, let's say English. And whether they're alone or traveling the world, that's the only language they're going to speak. But other people are able to speak in many different languages. Perhaps they mostly speak English, particularly if they're talking to themselves, but they have the ability to, say, speak Spanish, Polish, or Swedish as well. But it turns out they probably won't say many Swedish words unless they're talking to another Swede. And these bacterial compounds are like these words. English-speaking bacteria will talk to themselves in that chemical language and will make those words or chemical cues regardless of what conditions you grow them in. Finding those words or those chemical compounds is going to be easy, and they represent the antibiotics we can find just by grabbing bacteria from the dirt. But how can we get bacteria to speak in these other languages and start making some of these hidden chemical words? Well, my lab is doing this by mixing bacteria that also speak these other chemical languages. Our work exploits the idea that if we can trick bacteria into participating in these new chemical conversations with other species of bacteria, they may start to express or make these chemical words that would typically have remained hidden. So in my lab, we intentionally grow different species of bacteria together to see if we can stimulate these new conversations and get these bacteria to make new compounds that they only express when they're interacting or talking with each other. Now, we've already found some exciting preliminary success using this approach. We've identified one of these co-culture specific antibiotics that can kill pathogens that are otherwise highly antibiotic resistant. So this approach can work. We're also trying to figure out if we can identify any rules or guiding principles that will help us predict what kinds of bacterial interactions are most likely to stimulate these new chemical conversations, in the hope that we can make these experiments more efficient and scalable. Overall, we're very excited about using the power of bacterial chemical conversations to access this previously untapped reservoir of chemical communication. Some of these words may lead to the discovery of new antibiotics to treat infections caused by antibiotic-resistant bacteria.